Little louder? Can you make me a little louder? Thank you. So I received an invitation recently from someone I hadn't heard from in a few years, Nihal Sahan. She's one of the very few staff members at Pacifica Institute, which is the Turkish Cultural Center in Santa Clara. Some of you may remember that a few years ago, CBJ and Pacifica had a lovely little Muslim-Jewish dialogue group going. But like so many tenuous social bonds, our group disappeared during the pandemic. And now, out of the blue, an invitation from Nihal to serve on a panel for a study session about the story of Noah and the flood. It happens to be that this is a week when Turks are celebrating that story. She was also going to be inviting a pastor and an imam. I was the first to speak on the panel. In Noah's time, I told the people there, humanity had polluted the land with our evil ways. And that description speaks to us today as we see what we've done to our planet. Many heads in the room nodded in agreement with me. After the panel was over, a young man approached the dais. He spoke in a quiet voice, his face showing no emotion. "May I ask you a question?" All three of us nodded encouragement. The imam and I were easily old enough to be his parents. Our Christian colleague could have been his grandfather. "If the world were to be destroyed again," he said, almost in a murmur, "I hope it won't happen. But if it did, can someone help us build an ark and we'll be safe?" I looked at him for a hint of a smirk. There was none. He was dead serious. Afterward, on my way home, I thought about the young people closest to me. They joke about environmental destruction. They also joke about the future of our democracy, and their rueful laughter reminds me of a line by Israeli pop singer Arik Einstein, "Sachaknu bishvilo livkot." We laughed so as not to cry. One of my son's best friends, a Stanford undergrad, said to me not that long ago, "There's no way our democracy will exist in 20 years." I was stunned by his certainty. Later on my ride home, I thought about the many adults I know who are seriously thinking about leaving the country, thinking they might outrun the existential threats that so many of us fear. On Rosh Hashanah, I spoke to our community about the creation story and a tension between Genesis chapter 1, in which humanity is given dominion over the planet, and Genesis chapter 2, in which we are commanded to protect it. I told you about a conversation with Professor Liz Hadley, an ecologist at Stanford. In her words, quote, "We have impacted the cryosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the atmosphere, and the biosphere. In plain speak, all the big systems of planet Earth have been changed by human activity: the ice, the water, the land, the air, and all living things. And on Rosh Hashanah, I asked you to recognize that we cannot turn back the clock. We cannot erase the damage we have done or even stop all further damage from happening. But as a species, we have enormous power. And we can use our power to, again in Professor Hadley's words, quote, nudge the planet away from chaos, if we get serious about it, if we all work together." Tonight, I want to focus on the next few generations of Genesis, the flood and the Tower of Babel, and what these stories teach us about the very serious predicaments we are in today, both as a nation and as a species. It has always amazed me that our Torah understood humanity's potential to destroy the natural world. These stories date back to the Bronze Age. Estimated global population was 50 million on the entire planet, and yet our ancestors were convinced that the human capacity for violence could bring destruction down on the earth. To the folks at Pacifica Institute, I offered an image of humankind polluting the land. I was shading things a little. It wasn't pollution that brought Noah's flood. It was violence and social injustice. The rabbis of old coined a phrase, midah keneged midah, measure for measure, to describe their understanding of God's actions in this world. And if the sins of Noah's generation were social and not environmental, then the horrible climax of the story is a perfect example of midah keneged midah. A few survivors floating alone on a rickety boat with the ruins of their civilization submerged beneath them. That image is like a warning shouted down through the generations. This is what happens to a culture that is based on the premise of each man for himself. Not that social and environmental sins can so be neatly cleaved. Environmental destruction leads to violence and war, but also social discord leads to environmental harm. The power of our species is in our collective. We succeed when we collaborate, when we trust each other and feel invested in one another. As Jews, we should understand this well. How did we survive nearly 2,000 years of exile and oppression? The answer is sown implicitly on every page of this book. We always prayed as a we. It does not say, "Save me, please, my God." Our liturgy always says, "Save us, please, our God." That's called social capital, a sense of us and we, and it has to be nurtured at every level. When a person feels grounded in a family that needs and cares for them, surrounded by a community that supports them and to which they feel responsible, and connected to a nation or a people that they are proud of, that person will give more at every level. They'll volunteer more, donate more, show up more. It's why multiple studies have shown that individuals who are active in a church or a synagogue give more to charity and volunteer more than people who have no religious affiliation. And this is true even discounting the time and money given to the church itself. I'm inspired by the work of sociologist Robert Putnam. In his most recent book called The Upswing, he uses many different measures to assess Americans' sense of we. Economic disparities, bipartisan collaboration and split ticket voting, involvement in social clubs and churches and work unions, even pronoun usage. How often does the word I appear in American literature compared to we? And across all these different measures and many more, over the past century, he found a remarkably similar pattern, what he called an inverted U curve. His data start with the Gilded Age, which is roughly 1870 to 1900, and it was a time of deep economic disparities, rampant environmental destruction, horrific racism, and overall cultural narcissism. But we did not descend from there into apocalyptic disaster. Instead, our collective responsibility climbed slowly but steadily up until the 1960s, when the curve did an about face and began to fall again, bringing us steadily down to the lows of today. Putnam calls this inverted U an I, we, I curve. And out of all of his numbers and graphs, Putnam makes a crucial argument. I would call it a plea. The transition out of the golden age into a half century of nearly steady progress did not happen accidentally. It was the intentional work of reformers. Here's what Putnam says, quote, "The reformers included immigrants and elites, women and men, blacks and whites, housewives and career politicians, unionists and capitalists, college graduates and factory workers, top-down bureaucrats and bottom-up activists, Republicans and Democrats, and nearly everyone in between. The movement was so diverse as to be barely coherent and was home to contradictory impulses, but together they put in place a stunningly diverse and sweeping set of reforms and innovations, many of which form the basis of American society as we know it today. We did it then," he argues, "and we can do it again. But we have to be willing to tolerate those contradictory impulses. We have to grasp onto that sense of we without demanding that it wash away anyone's sense of I." If Jewish prayers are written to develop our sense of we, it is with the implicit understanding that a strong we is composed of many strong I's. This is why the foundational document of rabbinic Judaism, the Talmud, presents as a series of debates, most of which are left unresolved, because we Jews understand the importance of lifting up many voices. After the flood, Noah and his children spread out into the land and rebuilt it. Things started to be good again. But everyone on earth spoke only one language, and they began to build a city and a tower, and for some reason, their efforts ticked God off. The text does not tell us why. Dr. Judy Klitzner, in her book, Subversive Sequels in the Bible, offers an explanation that emerges from a really close read of the text. She notes that there are no individuals mentioned anywhere in the story of Babel. She also pays attention to the fact that the people wanted to create one name and that they were afraid of differentiation. Their sin, trying to erase individuality. Going back to Putnam's I, we, I curve, I told you the turning point was the 1960s. Historian Todd Gitlin described the first half of the 60s as years of hope, and the second half as days of rage. On the surface, it would seem that the sin of the 60s was exactly the opposite of the sin of Babel, not erasing individuality, but a turn toward cultural narcissism, the I valued above the we. But history's never that simple. My mentor and friend, Rabbi Shelley Lewis, served as a chaplain in Vietnam from 1970 to 71. He recently published his memoirs. They show him to have been then, as I know him to be now, ethical, gentle, generous, and an advocate for peace. While in Vietnam, for every Shabbat service, he composed a new prayer for peace. Rabbi Lewis did not have to serve. Clergy were protected from the draft. Here's what he wrote in his memoir, quote, "I struggled mightily with my decision. I did not want to be identified with support of the war, yet how could I not feel responsible for brethren who were drafted? So he enlisted to give his gifts of compassion to our soldiers who so badly needed them." Before he was deployed to Vietnam, Rabbi Lewis went to visit the Hillel House at the University of Washington, and here's what happened to him on campus as he was entering the Hillel building. In his own words, quote, "Approaching the entrance, I was confronted by several students. I was in uniform, and they could see from my insignia that I was a chaplain. I was immediately assaulted verbally. 'How can you be a man of God and still get out there and teach? Kill, kill, kill!' I was totally unprepared and stunned into silence. There was no opportunity to explain that I too was opposed to this war. Dressed as a soldier, I represented the war makers. I wanted to sink into the earth and disappear. Appalling. Those students let ideology override humanity. The anti-war movement became their we, and it left no room for the individual I. The person didn't matter, only the cause. And still today, our causes are different now, but too often we elevate them above real human beings. The response to the Tower of Babel was midah keneged midah, measure for measure. God mixed up the people's languages. Lo yishmu ish sfat re'eu. Each person could no longer hear their friend's language. The verb is yishma'u from shema. They couldn't hear. The building project had to be abandoned because the workers could no longer communicate. And so exactly what they feared came to pass. Diverse nations with diverse languages spread out in the land. Perhaps fracturing is the inevitable outcome of a we that denies the I. When we stop tolerating a multiplicity of views, our ties rupture. We can no longer hear anyone who does not speak exactly the way we do. Over the past few years, I've engaged in ongoing conversations with several people who I care very much about and with whom I very much disagree, on things like the efficacy of COVID vaccines, the reality of climate change, the insurrection of January 6th, even the FBI raid on our former president's home. And in each case, we eventually came to an impasse because it turned out we disagreed on the basic facts. Their trusted sources were simply different from mine. I have to tell you, these experiences shook me to my core. I believe so deeply in listening and learning from people I disagree with. But how can we learn from each other if we don't agree on the basic facts? It's as if we are speaking a different language. And if we can't talk, how can we build a tower, a city, a nation? But disengagement is not the answer. Fragmented, we cannot save either our democracy or our planet. The only alternative is to keep trying, even down on facts, even down to when we disagree on facts. If we have internalized the truth that we are all, then we can learn to withstand disagreements. I can tell you I see things differently from you. I can tell you that your facts are wrong and still remain in respectful relationship with you, even if we never agree. CBJ's Respectful Dialogue Group is called Tikva, hope, because our hope for our future rests on our ability to build a strong we composed of many strong I's. Join their efforts. I am asking each of you tonight to deepen your tolerance for uncomfortable conversations, to develop your capacity to stay connected even when you are angry or upset, to learn to disagree respectfully rather than disengage. Because if we cannot build our sense of mutual commitment, there will be no ark to rescue us. After the panel, that young man asked about building an ark. I was too dumbfounded to respond. Fortunately, my Christian colleague, Dr. Gerald Grudson, spoke up. When we all work together to find solutions, we ourselves become the ark, he said. That answer came really easily to Dr. Grudson because he's devoted the last 20 years of his life to building connections across faiths. And he is exactly right. All of us working together while maintaining our own identities, that is the ark that will rescue us. It is, in fact, the only one that ever has. So let us each commit tonight to make 5783 a year of strengthening our ties at every level, within our neighborhoods, within our CBJ community, in our country, in our people, and within our species, humanity, stewards of this glorious planet. Gmar Chatima Tova.